Today, I was going to speak about a comprehensive approach to addressing what we know as the global retirement funding challenge. And I'll do it with a focus on retirement income. I'll begin by talking about 6 different components that I believe are feasible and essential for the long-term sustainable retirement system. Some of them are in place now, some are on the drawing boards or could be put in place, but all are quite feasible. After briefly discussing those 6 components, I'm going to zero in and focus on one of them, Pillar 2, defined contribution plans. Now, before I get started, though, I think it's important to establish a couple of things. For one thing, if we have a retirement system, we say we have a good retirement, or what are we trying to do? Of course, we want to get everyone, at least as a goal, to try to achieve a good retirement. So let me just define what I believe to be a good retirement, and this is hardly original with me, that if I can get you to retirement so you could sustain the standard of living that you've enjoyed in the latter part of the rest of your work life for the rest of your life, that's a good retirement. Okay? Now, if it's standard of living that we have as our goal for good retirement, standard of living is always defined by income, not a pot of wealth. Okay? If you came to my city of Cambridge and said, I see how someone's living there, what would it take for me to live there like that? I wouldn't say to you, you need $2,737,000 in the bank. I would say to you, you'd have to be earning about X dollars if you want to live in that lifestyle. The purpose of the retirement system is an income goal, not a wealth goal. Secondly, if we're going to talk about solving the problem, we have to deal with reality, not dreams, not hypotheticals that can't be done, infeasible. So reality is the following, that if we are trying to achieve a goal of a good retirement and we're not doing as well as we'd like, which is good part of the story in many parts of the world, as we all know, including the United States as well, there are only 4 ways to improve your chances of a good retirement. Save more, which means consume less. Work longer before retiring. That way you get more saving and a shorter retirement period to fund, or take more investment risk. But if you do that, you better have plan B, as I say, to deal with the consequences if the risk is realized. It is not a feasible thing to talk about increasing return by taking more risk and then forget about the risk if this is not there. And of course, we'd all like more return for the same risk, but that's what we do every day. We can't dial that up. It isn't our control. We're trying all the time to achieve that goal. Now, these first 3 ways all have in mind essentially increasing the amount of assets one has in retirement to improve retirement benefits. The 4th way is different. It says improve income benefits in retirement from a given amount of accumulated retirement assets. That is to say, get more benefits for the same risk. In fact, I would say no risk as a benchmark. And there are basically 2 kinds of instruments or ways which for the broad population, working middle class people, and this is pretty much true in most parts of the world, there are 2 ways of doing that. One is the annuity. What does that mean? As you all know, you give money and you get paid an income for life. As long as you live, you even live to 120, you're still going to get that income. You never can outlive it. In return, though, when you've gone somewhere where you don't need money anymore, you give it up. Seems like a pretty fair trade. And particularly in low interest rate environments, the difference between the amount of permanent risk-free benefits that one can get with or without the so-called mortality dividend is quite substantial. So this moves the needle. The second one is equity extraction from the house. Now, this has to be done properly, but first, almost everywhere again in the world, the biggest asset that working middle class people have when they retire is typically their house, and that's what they need to live in. So it's certainly an annuity of its own. It's a consumption good, but it also has value that will sustain itself after you no longer need the house. Okay, And it's that value that if we can extract it and use that to buy more annuities to enhance it, then you can increase lifetime income no matter how long you live in an efficient way. Now, it's very important to understand that what I'm talking about here is equity extraction. It's something like what's called a reverse mortgage, or as in Korea, I think the name for it, which I prefer, is a home pension, which is a very specific kind of mortgage, which you don't make any payments on, and you can't be forced to pay principal back until after you stop living in the house, which takes away most of the risk to the retiree. I'm not talking here about equity extraction, taking a home equity loan, or just a standard mortgage, which of course has different risks for the beneficiary. So in summary, these four are the only ways. So if you only save 1%, no amount of financial engineering or efficiency is going to get you to a good retirement. And that's the reality we have to deal with. Now, that said, now let me turn now to the what I call 6 feasible components for funding retirement. First, pillar 1 is Social Security, defined benefit employer plans. Basically, this has been for a long time the gold standard for retirement benefits. It has the wonderful feature that by and large, the members don't have to do anything. They don't have any decisions to make. And when they get to retirement, they know they're going to get some benefits and they know what they are. And that's lovely. However, it is just not feasible to have a plan that we're going to somehow allow pillar 1 or Social Security or the employer plan, DB plans, fund people's retirement. It's just not feasible. We've seen that. It's the reality. And I think most people agree to that. So we come now to pillar 2, which, as we all know, are defined contribution plans, which of course shift some of the risks of the outcome to the members. And in turn for taking on those risks, the members are being asked to make decisions. And that's very difficult. And we're wrestling with this all the time. We talk about education. So this is the fastest growing area. This is the piece that is really critical right now. What I say we need to do with DC is make it as easy to use as DP with a comprehensive default offering. Most of us, until we're relatively near retirement, I don't know whether it's 10 years before retirement, 15 or whatever, most of us really don't know what we want in retirement, other than we probably think we would like to have a good retirement. So the point of the matter is that it is not really meaningful to put in detailed planning of exactly what you're going to do in retirement. So what you do is you have a sort of default plan where people are focused on building their careers, other parts of their life cycle, and don't really think about retirement in much the same way they did with DB, except that what you're doing is you have a very well-designed, functioning default system of investing that gathers the appropriate information without asking the people what for that information. So they really don't have to do anything. The amount of effort is nearly no much more than a DB plan. Now, at some point, whether it's 10 years, 5 years, 15 years, or whatever, 20 years before retirement, the members may become engaged and say, now I know where I am, what I'm doing, and so forth. And so I'd like to become engaged in making system decisions that are more tailored to their preferences. That's fine, that's great, and we ought to have a very robust tool. But if we're going to have that kind of tool where people have to make decisions on this important matter, we have to have that the tool is designed so it doesn't require any financial knowledge or literacy that they don't already have. In other words, it should communicate in terms that they already understand. If you want an example of that in other parts of consumer lives, think of the automobile. Much progress of that over the last 60, 70 years. But if you get into a 1955 Ford or you get into a 2020 Ford, you'll see they both have steering wheels, they both have accelerators and where they're located and so forth. And that's not an accident. It's purposely designed so that people can get into almost any car, a rental car they've never driven, and they can drive and they don't have to go through a manual or take an exam or study all the different models. We know on the In the technology area of consumer products, say cell phones, mobile phones, same idea, that if you have a product that people actually have to go through the manual to figure out how to use, you're in trouble. Today, the idea is that only the manual is there for getting repairs or something of that sort. That means in design, in finance, and this goes beyond just retirement, we should focus not so much on trying to teach people finance, but rather design products that use the information and knowledge base that individuals already have so they don't have to be educated. And I'll illustrate that in a few moments. And finally, we want to make sure that in the DC plan, like DB, that the transition from the work period, the accumulation period, to the pay down period is smooth and easy and customized, because at retirement, you really know what your needs are, you know your health and so forth. Pillar 3 deals with what do we, if we're going to solve the problem of retirement for our country, we have to cover everyone. I don't mean just people who have Social Security or employer plans, but uncovered workers. They still need to be able to retire. And even those who are covered by plans, sometimes the benefits are simply inadequate for those people's need. So both these groups need some way of personal saving in order to be able to prepare themselves for retirement. And here, again, I'll only just brush on this. One kind of solution that one came up with, indeed, working with a colleague of mine, Ron Molitar, that we have developed a thing called selfies. That's just an acronym, which we call a pension bond. And pension bond is nothing more than a kind of government bond, like we were all familiar with, except the stream of payments in it look strange. Namely, if I'm a 30-year-old, 35-year-old, I'm planning to retire in 30 years, 2050, then, if I have a pension, I put my money into the pension now or the 401k, whatever, and I don't get anything out of that until I retire 30 years from now. So what we say is design a government bond with the same payout pattern. So a 2050 selfie, a 2050 pension bond would have the feature that if you bought it today, you get no payouts on it until 2050. And then when you reach 2050, it makes a stream of equal payments, let's say for 25 years, in order to simulate. It's very close to what you would get if you were putting your money in a pension plan. And this is all designed to make it simple to use, low cost to use. You don't have to explain risk, and very intuitive in the sense of what they need to do, and no need to do any reinvestment decisions and transactions and so forth, as you would do with a standard bond that pays a coupon every 6 months. So pillar 3 is you have to cover uncovered workers. Now, pillar 4, I come back to what I mentioned earlier in remarks, is getting the most benefits from the accumulated assets. And as I've already mentioned, the thing that does that the most is the reverse mortgage, taking advantage of the savings of the house. And it's materially important as a practical matter because people's savings, for the most part, working middle class people's savings, is the house. So by using the house, it's a big asset. It therefore can move the needle in terms of benefits. It does not require the changing people's saving behavior. And the other is the annuities, as I mentioned, that by giving up your money when you don't need it, you can get a lot more money for as long as you need it. And those two together can have a very big impact. If you look at kind of a 50th percentile income person in the United States, a prototypical case, it's possible to move from accumulation, which would give you only 60% of your goal or a good retirement. But by using annuities rather than just bonds, and by adding a reverse mortgage, those two together can bring it up to 100%. Why I focus on those is those are practical and they have order one big potential impact. And we're going to need to use these and around the world, not just in the developed countries. Number 5, we mentioned one of the ways to improve accumulation is work longer. That's a nice idea, but not always available to everyone. So what I'm suggesting here we ought to explore is developing this in a systematically organized way, retirement-friendly structures of employment. Now, I don't mean, make work jobs. I'm talking about real jobs, but jobs that are tailored for seniors. Seniors clearly don't have some of the things that a 30-year younger person has in terms of being willing to put big investment into the learning curve if they don't have that much longer they're going to be working, etc. They may have some physical limitations. On the other hand, they have a lot of accumulated knowledge. They tend to be much calmer, I think, but that's a matter of interpretation. But one thing for sure, they're not worried about building a career. So they can do the kinds of jobs very well that are tailored to these comparative advantages. And I have in mind anything from looking after very, very young children so they don't have to be physically moving so much, but where they have focus and experience, most of them. Another would be, and we've seen this in certain parts of the world, in the parks doing the flowers and doing other things which are wonderful and needed, not, again, make work jobs, and which attention and focus, but can be tailored to a number of hours a day that's appropriate for someone in a transition from full-time employment to full-time retirement. And if someone has skills in their work life, say an engineer, you bring them into the schools, use them there. So the idea here, though, is different, is both in the public and private sector to, in a systematic way, organize jobs for seniors. It'll improve the productivity of society, of the people in society. It will be more practical because we know that just trying to keep a job or even try to find a job when you're close to retirement can be very difficult, and therefore you can't count on it. And the whole idea here is that if people can see that as an ordinary part of the retirement process, and finally, it has some good psychological impacts for people because it allows them to go through a phase of full-time working to full-time retirement. So that's the fifth. The last and sixth one really came out of in space around the world in COVID-19, the pandemic, where we've seen that suddenly people's incomes dropped dramatically. They weren't able to work, not allowed to work. And that shock clearly made people poor. We know from life cycle consumption smoothing that the issue here is that we should reduce our not just our current consumption, but our future consumption. And so instead of taking a big hit to current consumption and trying to sustain a higher standard of living than we can sustain, then we're going to have, in the spirit of what I talked about, is a balance between standard of living and retirement and standard of living and working. It makes sense in some cases to actually draw down on, especially for people closer to retirement, to draw down on some of their retirement to smooth out consumption. So we may want to have our retirement system, not as a savings account, but as retirement system, what broader life cycle related, certainly for things like crises. So having covered the 6 fundamental components for the retirement system, I'm now going to move on to an in-depth look at one of them, namely Pillar 2, the DC plan, which is very important now and in the moment now. And I want to focus in particular on the importance of retirement income principles and designing it and presenting the materials in the right way for people to make intelligent decisions. So we start here, we look at a typical, as we know, we're required by regulations to show people their account balance at any point in time based on market prices. And that's the standard mode. And the question I will raise to you is, what can you do with that information? What does an individual who wants to find out or have a sense of where they are with respect to their retirement plan? Are they on mark? Are they running behind? So forth. And so now consider someone, say a 42-year-old who has a $1 million account balance. How does that information on his account allow it to decide whether he's on mark, behind, or doing very well in terms of retirement accumulation? And to underscore this is this is not about being trained in finance. It's recognizing that this number, it doesn't give you an answer about what matters, which is your standard of living that you could acquire with this in retirement. And the reason is standard of living is income. Now, with $1 million, you don't know what you can get with just that piece of information. 13 years ago, you could buy a 10-year US Treasury bond paying 5%. That $1 million would have meant $50,000 a year income. And that would have been similar to what you could have gotten an annuity for, okay, in terms of income, right? What do you get today in 2020? 0.2%, 67 basis points. That's $6,700. So you've gone from 50,000 to 6,700 in income. That's the standard of living change. 87% decline, and yet in both cases the balance is the same. So it's clear that balance really isn't sufficient, and this has nothing to do even with whether you have all the skills of compound interest and so forth. And this is not about education in the usual sense. A very, one of my 150 IQ, 3 PhDs, nanotechnology, MIT colleagues, curious and everything else, given this information, couldn't answer this question. Most finance professionals wouldn't be able to do it without other data. So the point here is what we provide now in DC plans is basically very inferior information that can be used in another way. Now let's contrast that if instead we show the amount of real income. I say real here because if it's the standard of living, we would need to take account of inflation. If we look at if I told you instead is the symbol that you have enough in your account to have $55,000 a year income in retirement, that's something all of us can relate to, independent of education. We all understand income because we need to understand income to live. If you tell me $55,000 is what I can buy as the standard of living, and I'm living at 100,000, then I know that either I'm going to have to take a very substantial reduction in standard of living, and I could think about what it would take for me, or I better, do some efforts to increase it. So the difference is simply in showing income instead of accumulation amount puts person in a position where they instantly know where they are and therefore can think intelligently about the process. So income is the right assessment and the right information, and it meets the criteria that you really don't have to educate people in order for them to be able to use this number and make intelligent decisions. Well, having established the importance of income and the value of it, I now have the happy outcome to announce that in 2019, here in the United States, we created the Secure Act, and in Mexico, pension reform, they consider a similar act, both which require now that DC plans will have to report the retirement income that could be purchased in that account based on the account balance at the time. This is exactly what we need to have done. And the act calls, both of the acts call that you use current market bond yields to calculate that future income. And that's critical because if you use wished for interest rates, average interest rates, historical interest rates, that's like using bond prices or stock prices from another time and reporting those, or what we wish our portfolio was worth rather than what you could actually sell it for. So these mandate current bond prices. Now, in the spirit of it being the World Pension Summit, I've been talking in US dollars. Let me move now to pesos and the implementation in Mexico. And what you see here on a given point in time is for different age members of the plans, a 30-year-old who's got 30 years till retirement, all the way up to a 60-year-old who's about to retire with different accumulations. And above on the blue line, and on the lighter blue line, we have the amount of monthly income that they would report or would be shown on the screen to them that they have. Now, in the gold box or yellow box in the middle, we have a hypothetical inserted. We have two 50-year-olds. It's the same person, same age, but on the left side, we have the current existing situation in which the person has 150,000 accumulation, and with the term structure for Mexican inflation bonds, that's $950 a month. But then we ask the question, what happens if interest rates were 1% higher, 100 basis points higher? Okay. And at the same time, to show the effect, we also say, what if instead of having 150, we only had 140? So actually, we have a smaller accumulation at age 50 in the second hypothetical. Look what the result is. With the 140, even though it's less than the 150, so the accumulated amount is actually down or less, the income is 1,040 versus 950, almost 10% higher. And that's the number that matters in terms of retirement. That's your standard of living in retirement that you could purchase. So this shows two things. One, the importance of interest rates. And second, that looking at accumulation, even if accumulation is lower, does not mean that the member is worse off. They may actually be better off, again, because you're measuring it in the right way. Emphasizing in my last parts of my remarks on the income principle, I want to show how important it is to look at income and be given the income information and use that as the metric for whether you're better off or not than wealth. And so, what's the risk-free asset? What's the hedging asset? Well, normally we think of the risk-free asset when we're talking about regular investment is something in US dollars like US Treasury bill, very low returns, but also very little value, price, wealth volatility. It's the gold standard in wealth preservation. On the other hand, and that's demonstrated in the left-hand graph that I've shown here, which are actual numbers for the United States for real returns on 90-day Treasury bills over the last 15 years or so. And you see very flat, very little volatility, and very low return. But what if we look at it from the point of view of what matters to a retiree and a retirement plan, which is not the value of the account, but how much income you can have in retirement? When we measure it in those units, sometimes called the funded ratio, which is income that we could buy to income we would like to, is our goal. Then we see on the right side that a Treasury bill has enormous income volatility, huge, that it probably is the most risky asset you could buy for a retirement account focused on income. And it's very risky. So there's not any connection between the left graph, which measures it in wealth units, dollars today, versus income units, dollars of income in retirement on the right side. So if we measure it wrong, we can't possibly manage the risk right. So it's fundamental that we not only for communication show people income, but for managing and understanding risk. The risk matters is in income in retirement, not in the wealth value of the portfolio. Okay. Now the flip side of that is if we bought a perfectly hedged for income portfolio, say in US dollars, I say long-term tips with the payments matched to the payments in retirement, if we did that and we measure it in the usual way we do in wealth, in the left side, at asset value, because they're very long duration assets, the price of those bonds have considerable volatility, as you can see over this period in the United States. It's almost as volatile as the stock market. So that looks very risky. And if we were looking at our account balance, we would see it bouncing around. When in reality, the thing that matters to us, income, that's shown in the right side graph, if we've matched the payments, we've hedged, immunized our retirement income, then there's no risk at all. So two things happen here. First, Treasury bills give us low wealth risk, but we're using the wrong measure of risk-free. And if we hold the bonds, we get high volatility. Now, this has induced another problem in DC world. Those managing accounts who want to put more people more and more into fixed income as they get nearer to retirement, if they put them in long duration assets, as you can see, the value of their account can fluctuate considerably, even though it's a long-term bond. And when people are shown the value of the account and not the relevant number, which is the income, and they see, for example, if interest rates go up, that the value of their account has gone down, they think they've lost a considerable amount of their retirement income. And that's very disturbing. And when the members are disturbed, then their employers are disturbed when they hear from the members, and then the employers tell the providers who are managing this, we can't have this kind of price volatility as you see on the left screen, do something about it. So what do? They put it in 2-year notes, gets rid of the volatility in value, but actually gives you back huge volatility in income. So it's not just a matter of one unit or another, it actually has affected behavior. So in sum, it's really, really important that for the success of DC plans, for being able to produce a DC plan where people can look at the numbers we give them and understand them well enough to make decisions without having to go back to school and learn finance or study a manual, that we get the measure right and that we think of risk in terms of income and we bring that in. That's going to be a really important step. And I'm excited about the fact that we now have legislation that will help implement it. That's my message to you for today. Income, and let's do it and do it right and get the risks right. I'll close as I began. All of this is important, but let us not forget that there are only 4 ways to improve the chances of achieving a good retirement. Save more, work longer, take more risk, and make sure that you improve the income benefits as much as possible with available instruments with the accumulated amount. And let's all hope that this is a major step forward in reaching lifetime retirement benefits and curing, or at least addressing materially, the global crisis in retirement funding. Thank you.